Thunder rolled across the empty Wyoming plains, a giant's angry voice in the sky. Josiah Crawford felt the vibration in his bones. He leaned his back against a splintered fence post, watching the dark clouds swallow the sun whole. His ranch wasn't a home anymore. It was a graveyard of broken dreams. Dead cattle were scattered across the brown, thirsty grass. The barn leaned sideways, creaking and groaning with every gust of wind, like an old man trying to draw his last breath. And the house. The house hadn't heard the sound of laughter in 5 long, silent years. The year was 1869, and it had been cruel to everyone in the territory. But for Josiah, it felt personal. It felt like hate. His wife, Martha, and his boy, Samuel, had been taken by the fever while he was away in Denver trying to sell horses. He came home to 2 fresh graves and a silence that screamed. Then the drought came and killed his crops, turning his fields to dust. Now the bank wanted his land. A crumpled letter in his pocket was his death warrant. 30 days. Final notice. The bold black letters looked like tiny coffins lined up in a row. He was 42 years old, but he felt like an ancient tree, hollowed out from the inside, just waiting for the next strong wind to push him over. That's when he heard it. Crying. At first he thought it was just the wind, playing its usual cruel tricks on a lonely man's mind. But the sound came again. It was soft, scared, and unmistakably human. Josiah squinted, his eyes straining against the dust storm that was kicking up. Through the swirling brown haze, he saw them. 2 small shapes stumbling toward his gate. They moved like ghosts, thin and wobbly on their feet, barely managing to stay upright against the wind's assault. They looked like they might blow away at any second. "Please, mister," a young voice called out, thin and reedy but fighting to be heard over the howl of the wind. "We need help." Josiah's heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone, gave a painful lurch in his chest. He pushed himself off the fence post and walked slowly toward the gate, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. 2 girls stood there clinging to the broken gate, holding hands so tightly it looked like they were afraid the world itself might try to tear them apart. The older one couldn't have been more than 12. She had tangled dark hair and big green eyes that had seen far too much sadness for someone so young. The smaller girl, maybe 8 years old, was sucking her thumb and trying to hide behind her sister's torn and faded dress. She was a bundle of fear with blonde hair and wide, terrified blue eyes. The older girl lifted her chin, a gesture of pride that seemed out of place on her grimy, tear-streaked face. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. "Name's Catherine," she said. "This is Grace. Our mama and papa. They died of the fever back in Laramie town. We walked for 3 days. We ain't had no food." Josiah just stared at them. He felt something deep inside his chest crack, a sharp, painful sound like ice breaking on a frozen pond in the first thaw of spring. These girls, they looked exactly how he felt. They were lost, hungry, and completely forgotten by the world. The smart thing to do, the logical thing, would be to turn them away. He could barely feed himself. How in God's name was he supposed to take on 2 extra mouths? He should point them toward Cheyenne. There was a territorial orphanage there. They would take them in, give them a roof and a meal. That was the responsible thing to do. But he looked at Catherine's brave, defiant face, and he looked at Grace's frightened eyes, and he couldn't make his mouth form the words. The words wouldn't come. Instead, he heard a voice he barely recognized as his own, rough with disuse, speaking into the wind. "Well," the voice said, "I reckon I could use some help around this old place." For just a second, Catherine's suspicious, guarded look melted away, and he saw the scared little girl hiding underneath. Hope flickered in her green eyes. "You really mean it, mister?" "Name's Josiah Crawford," he said, opening the creaking gate. "And yes, I mean every word." He led them toward the silent, empty house, the house that had forgotten the sound of a child's footsteps. As they walked, a cold feeling crawled up his spine like a spider. This moment felt bigger than just helping 2 hungry kids. It felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to take a step into the unknown. It felt like he was starting something that would change everything, forever. But as the wind howled around them and the first drops of cold rain began to fall, he had no idea what he was truly getting himself into. He was just a broken man on a broken ranch. What he didn't know was that he had just invited a miracle and a whirlwind of danger into his life. 3 weeks later, the Crawford Ranch was a different place. It was like someone had breathed life back into its dying body. The silence was gone, replaced by the buzz of activity, like a beehive in the springtime. Catherine, it turned out, had magic hands with the horses. Even Old Thunder, the meanest, most stubborn stallion Josiah had ever owned, a beast that had thrown every ranch hand who ever dared to climb on his back, would eat sugar cubes right from her palm. She spoke to the animals in a low, soothing voice, and they seemed to understand her in a way they never understood men. Grace, the little one, was a wizard, with a needle and thread. She took Josiah's torn workshirts and patched them up so perfectly you couldn't even tell they'd ever been ripped. She moved with a quiet focus, her small fingers working with a precision that was startling. But the biggest change, the one that made Josiah's heart ache with a strange mix of joy and sorrow, was the sound of laughter. It floated through the house, drifted across the yard, and seemed to chase away the ghosts of the past. "Josiah, look what I made!" Grace called out one afternoon, her small legs pumping as she ran across the yard. She held something clutched tightly in her hands. She'd sewn a tiny horse from scraps of old fabric. It was perfect, right down to the miniature saddle and bridle that looked just like the real thing. "That's mighty fine work, little one," Josiah said, his voice thick. He knelt down to get a better look, and his heart felt warm in a way it hadn't since before the fever. Since before Martha and Samuel. Maybe taking these girls in wasn't such a crazy idea after all. That night, a storm was brewing, both outside and in. The wind rattled the window panes, and rain lashed against the roof. After Grace had fallen asleep, tucked into the small bed he'd made for her in Samuel's old room, Josiah noticed a strange golden glow coming from the barn. It was a soft, flickering light, out of place in the dead of night. Curiosity got the better of him. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his lantern, and crept across the muddy yard, the wind trying to tear his coat from his back. He peeked through a wide gap in the wooden boards of the barn, and what he saw inside made his jaw drop like a rock falling down a deep, dark well. Catherine was sitting cross-legged in a pile of clean hay, completely absorbed in her work. She was surrounded by dozens of tiny, gleaming metal pieces that sparkled and shone in the lamplight. In her hands, she held his father's broken pocket watch, the one he kept in a drawer, a keepsake too precious to throw away but too broken to use. But she wasn't just holding it. She was doing something impossible. Her fingers, small and delicate, moved with the confidence and precision of a master surgeon. She was adjusting impossibly small springs and gears with tools that looked too big and clumsy for her small hands, tools she must have found in his old workshop. As Josiah watched, his breath caught in his throat, the watch began to tick. It was a perfect, steady rhythm, the sound of a heart beating again. "How in tarnation did you learn to do that?" he whispered, his voice full of awe. He couldn't help himself. He had to step inside. Catherine's hands froze. She looked up, and the fear that flashed across her face was a physical thing. It was the same raw terror he'd seen in her eyes that very first day at the gate, the look of a cornered animal. She looked like she'd been caught stealing. "My papa," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "He taught me. Before the sickness got him. He said I had special fingers. He said I could fix anything." Josiah knelt beside her in the hay, the smell of rain and horses filling the air. He studied the intricate dance of gears and springs inside the open watch. The work was flawless. It was better than anything he'd ever seen from the trained, expensive watchmakers in Denver. This is incredible, Catherine," he said, his voice low. "You've got a real gift. A true gift from God." Her face crumpled with worry. "Please," she begged, her green eyes wide and desperate. "Please don't tell nobody. Folks, they get strange ideas about girls doing man's work." They think it ain't right. They think it ain't natural. In that moment, looking into her frightened eyes, Josiah saw a reflection of himself. He knew that feeling. He knew what it was like when people looked at you and decided you weren't good enough, that you weren't worth their time or respect. He knew the sting of being judged and found wanting. He placed a gentle, calloused hand on her shoulder. "Your secret's safe with me, child," he promised. "But Catherine, this talent of yours, it's going to be important someday. I can feel it." What neither of them saw, what neither of them could possibly have known, was the dark shadow that detached itself from the far wall of the barn. They didn't see the glint of metal that caught the moonlight for a fraction of a second as their hidden watcher melted back into the stormy night. Someone had been spying on them. Someone had been listening. And now, someone else knew Catherine's secret too. And in the wilds of Wyoming, a secret like that was a dangerous thing to have. Catherine's fingers moved like magic across the broken pieces of metal, each tiny cog and spring finding its perfect home, as if guided by an unseen force. 3 weeks. It had only been 3 weeks since that first hungry, desperate night. But the Crawford Ranch was already humming with a new kind of energy. Grace, sweet little Grace, would hum old lullabies while she hung laundry on the line, her small hands surprisingly strong and capable from the farm work. She was blossoming under the open sky. But it was Catherine's secret, hidden talent that held the power to change everything. "Where on earth did you learn such a skill?" Josiah had whispered, his voice filled with awe. That first night, he discovered her midnight workshop in the barn. The golden lamplight hadn't just revealed a single fixed watch. It had revealed an impossible sight. Scattered across the clean hay bales were dozens of mechanical wonders, things that shouldn't exist on a dirt-poor ranch in the middle of nowhere. There were clocks that chimed with melodies so perfect they could make a grown man weep. There were music boxes with tiny, intricate dancing figures that moved with a life of their own. There were strange, wonderful gadgets that Josiah couldn't even put a name to, all ticking and whirring and spinning in the quiet of the barn. Catherine's green eyes had sparkled with a mixture of pride and fear as she carefully adjusted a delicate spring on another device. "Papa taught me," she'd said softly, her voice a fragile thing in the vast silence. "Before the sickness took him. He was the finest watchmaker in all of Laramie. He said I had hands blessed by angels." Josiah knelt beside the remarkable child, completely mesmerized. He watched her restore life to broken timepieces, with movements that were smoother than silk. Each gear clicked into place with a quiet, satisfying precision. The air in the barn smelled of metal polish, old leather, and a new, unfamiliar scent. Hope. "My papa," he said something else too. Catherine had continued that night, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, as if the words themselves were dangerous. "He said, folks get mighty strange ideas about girls who can do man's work. They think it ain't natural." The weight of those words settled heavy on Josiah's shoulders. He understood it all too well. He knew the crushing burden of being different, of carrying gifts that other people couldn't understand or accept. His own dreams of building a prosperous ranch had been crushed by men in fine suits who thought a poor farmer couldn't amount to much more than the dirt on his boots. "Your secret stays safe with me, little one," he'd promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "But Catherine, this gift of yours, it's going to open doors you never dreamed possible." Neither of them noticed the shadow that had crept away from the barn wall. Neither of them heard the soft, nearly silent footsteps disappearing into the darkness. But someone else now knew about Catherine's extraordinary abilities. And in the vast, empty plains of Wyoming, word travels fast, carried on the wind like a dangerous seed. The days turned into weeks. October arrived, painting the cottonwood trees along the creek in brilliant shades of gold and orange. Catherine's confidence grew with each passing day. She fixed every broken thing on the ranch, from the squeaky hinges on the gate to Josiah's father's old hunting rifle, which now shot truer than it had in 20 years. Grace, too, was discovering her own talents. She mended clothes with stitches so tiny and perfect they looked like they'd been painted on with a fine brush. The three of them had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, a quiet dance of chores and shared meals. They were becoming a family. But late at night, when the prairie winds howled across the endless grasslands, a lonely, mournful sound. Catherine would lie awake in her bed. She would press her ear to her pillow and listen. Listen for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Something deep in her heart, a primal instinct she couldn't explain, whispered to her that their peaceful days were numbered. The same sharp instincts that had kept her and Grace alive on the dangerous, unforgiving streets of Laramie after their parents died were now screaming warnings she couldn't ignore. "Grace," she whispered one moonless evening, the darkness in their small room thick and heavy. "Promise me something." Grace's sleepy voice drifted through the darkness. "What is it, Catherine?" "If bad men ever come for us, you run. You run to that old oak tree behind the well. You hide there until I come and fetch you. You hear me?" "What bad men, Catherine?" Grace asked, her voice small and laced with confusion. "Just promise me, Grace. Promise." "I promise," Grace mumbled, already drifting back to sleep. But Catherine knew. She knew that promises meant very little when the wolves came hunting for the lambs. And somewhere out there, in the vast, dark distance, she could almost hear them. The wolves were already sharpening their teeth. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and menacing. The chilly October winds were bringing more than just a change in the weather to the Crawford ranch. The first threat didn't arrive on horseback. It arrived in a fancy black carriage, a vehicle so out of place on the dusty, rutted Wyoming trails that it looked like it had fallen from another world. Ezra Holcomb stepped down from his expensive ride like a spider emerging from its web. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, somehow immaculate despite the long, dusty journey from Cheyenne. His pale, washed-out eyes held the cold, detached calculation of a man who viewed everything and everyone as property, things to be bought, sold, or discarded. "Crawford," he called out, his voice thin and sharp. He consulted a gold pocket watch with a theatrical flourish, as if his time was infinitely more valuable than Josiah's. "I trust you've been considering our previous discussions, specifically those regarding your outstanding debts." Josiah emerged from the barn, his face set like stone. Catherine and Grace appeared behind him, flanking him like two loyal soldiers ready for battle. The morning air, crisp and cool, suddenly crackled with a new, dangerous tension. The two men faced each other across the dusty yard, a chasm of wealth and power between them. "I've got till December to settle up, Holcomb," Josiah replied, his voice steady, despite the fear churning like sour milk in his gut. "That was our agreement. Signed and witnessed." Holcomb's laugh was a terrible sound. It was like breaking glass being scattered across a stone floor. "Ah, but circumstances, my dear Crawford, have a way of changing, don't they? The bank has reassessed the situation. They've decided to accelerate the timeline. You now have exactly 30 days. Grace pressed closer to Josiah's protective bulk, her small hand gripping the fabric of his trousers. But Catherine, she stepped forward. Her green eyes were blazing with a fire that seemed too big for her small body. Her fists were clenched at her sides, white-knuckled with righteous anger. "This here's Mr. Crawford's land, Mr. Fancy Pants," she declared, her voice ringing with fierce, unwavering courage. "You got no right comin' here and making threats." "Catherine," Josiah warned gently, though a fierce pride swelled in his chest at her bravery. He put a restraining hand on her shoulder. Holcomb's cold, reptilian gaze shifted from Josiah to the girls. He studied them with a disturbing, predatory interest, like a hawk circling high above two mice in an open field. "How delightfully naive," he sneered. "Tell me, Crawford, have you properly registered these children with the territorial authorities? I imagine the good people at the orphanage would find their current living situation most irregular. Unsanctioned, even." The threat hung in the cool autumn air like smoke from a distant, unseen fire. Josiah felt his world tilting dangerously, the ground shifting beneath his feet. The fragile, precious happiness they had built together over the past few weeks suddenly felt like it was balanced on the razor's edge of a knife. After Holcomb departed, his sinister black carriage disappearing in a cloud of dust, Catherine found Josiah sitting on the porch steps. His weathered face was buried in his calloused hands. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold, but the shadows gathering in the corners of their vision were long and dark. "We could disappear," Catherine whispered, her voice low. She sat down beside him on the steps, her small shoulder pressing against his arm. "Grace and me, we know how. We know how to vanish when danger comes calling." Josiah looked up at her, and in her determined green eyes, he didn't see a frightened child. He saw a fellow warrior, a survivor who understood the crushing weight of impossible choices. "No running, little one," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not this time. We stand our ground. We fight." But deep in his bones, he felt the approaching storm. He could feel the change in the air, the drop in pressure. The shadow that had witnessed Catherine's mechanical genius in the barn weeks ago had done more than just spy. It had set wheels in motion, powerful and relentless wheels that were now rolling toward them, threatening to crush everything they held dear. That night, as the Wyoming winds howled their mournful song across the endless grasslands, none of them noticed the lone rider. A mysterious figure, sitting motionless on a distant ridge, watching the small, vulnerable ranch house through a spyglass. The figure watched for hours as the lights in the house went out one by one. Then finally, the rider turned their horse away, melting back into the darkness, carrying news that would soon bring far more dangerous visitors to their door. Time was running out, faster than sand through an hourglass, and their enemies were closing in from all sides. Thunder rolled across the morning sky, not from a storm, but from the sound of hoofbeats. 7 horses, charging toward the Crawford Ranch like a cavalry unit. At the head of the group rode Sheriff Morton Briggs, his silver star badge catching the early morning light like a warning signal. Behind him, looking smug and triumphant, was the smooth-talking bankman, Holcomb, whose black suit made him look like a crow perched among the dusty riders. But it was the third man, the man riding a magnificent black stallion, who made Josiah's blood turn to ice in his veins. Professor Aldrich Peaton sat tall and straight in his saddle, wearing fine Eastern clothes that were completely out of place in the Wyoming territory. His gray hair was slicked back perfectly, without a single strand out of place. His pale, intelligent eyes studied the ranch not with curiosity, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a snake watching a nest of mice. And when he smiled, a thin, bloodless curve of his lips, the smile didn't come anywhere near those cold, dead eyes. "Josiah Crawford," Sheriff Briggs called out, his voice booming across the yard, a voice used to commanding attention and obedience. "We have reason to believe you're keeping children here who ain't properly registered with the territorial authorities. Under the law, that makes them wards of the state. Hand them over, and maybe we can talk about your money troubles." Josiah stepped out onto his porch. He felt Catherine and Grace press close behind him, their small bodies trembling. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might burst. "These girls are family now, Sheriff," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction he didn't know he possessed. "You've got no right to take them." Professor Peaton urged his fancy horse forward, moving with an easy, arrogant grace. He spoke in a voice as smooth as honey, but twice as dangerous. "Mr. Crawford, surely you want what is best for the children. I represent the esteemed California Institute for Advanced Learning. We have heard reports of a young girl with a remarkable aptitude for mechanics. Young Catherine would receive the finest education money can buy, an opportunity of a lifetime." Catherine grabbed Josiah's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh like claws. "How does he know my name?" she whispered, her voice tight with panic. But Josiah already knew the terrible, sickening answer. The spy in the shadows. The lone rider on the ridge. Someone had been watching them. Someone had seen Catherine's secret work in the barn and had sold that secret to the highest bidder. "The child possesses remarkable gifts," Peaton continued, his cold smile growing wider, more predatory. "Gifts that shouldn't be wasted in this primitive existence. In San Francisco, she could work alongside the greatest minds of our time. Imagine the wonders she could create. "I ain't leaving," Catherine declared. She stepped out from behind Josiah, her small body rigid with defiance. Her young voice shook, but she lifted her chin with a fierce, unwavering pride. "This is my home." Peyton's mask of polite concern slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing something cruel and ugly underneath. "My dear girl," he said, his voice losing its honeyed tone and taking on a sharp, metallic edge. "You misunderstand the situation entirely." The morning air grew thick and heavy with unspoken threats. The mounted men spread out, forming a loose but inescapable circle around the small house, cutting off any chance of escape. Grace whimpered and buried her face in Josiah's shirt, her small body shaking uncontrollably. Catherine's hands, Josiah saw, were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists at her sides. "You see," Peyton said, reaching into the pocket of his fine coat. He pulled out a rolled-up piece of parchment tied with a ribbon. "I have here a contract. A contract with certain very wealthy investors back east. They are extremely interested in mechanical innovations, particularly those created by young, malleable, trainable minds." The horrible, sickening truth hit Josiah like a physical punch to the gut. This wasn't about education. It wasn't about opportunity. This was about slavery. This was about stealing Catherine's brilliant, beautiful mind and using it to make other, greedier men rich. Sheriff Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his gaze flickering from Peyton to Josiah. "Now, Professor," he said, his voice laced with uncertainty. "You assured me this was all on the up and up, all legal-like." "Oh, it is, Sheriff, it is," Peyton assured him with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The children are unregistered orphans. That makes them wards of whoever can provide for their proper care and tutelage. I have excellent references." Josiah's rifle. It was leaning against the porch rail, just 3 short steps away. So close, yet 1,000,000 miles away. 7 armed men surrounded his property. One wrong move, one sudden gesture, and Catherine and Grace would be in terrible, mortal danger. And then, Catherine did something that surprised everyone. She laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a sharp, defiant bark of a laugh, full of scorn and fire. "You want to see what I can build?" she called out, her voice carrying across the yard with a newfound confidence that sent a shiver down Josiah's spine. "You think you know what I'm capable of?" Before anyone could react, before anyone could stop her, she turned and sprinted toward the barn, her small legs pumping like pistons. "Grace, come on!" Grace, without a moment's hesitation, ran right behind her. "Stop them!" Peyton shouted, his voice cracking with sudden alarm. But it was too late. The 2 girls had already disappeared into the shadowy darkness of the barn, and that's when the ground began to shake. A low, rumbling sound started deep within the barn, a sound none of them had ever heard before. It grew louder and louder, a deep, mechanical growl that vibrated through the soles of their boots. A roar like angry thunder erupted from the barn as the huge wooden doors burst open, torn from their hinges with a crash of splintering wood that echoed across the prairie. And what rolled out into the morning sunlight defied every law of nature and God that the men thought they knew. Catherine sat at the controls of a machine that gleamed like captured sunlight. The old, broken-down farm wagon had been transformed into something straight out of a dream or a nightmare. Brass gears the size of dinner plates spun in perfect, hypnotic harmony. Steam hissed from a network of carefully placed copper pipes, and the whole impossible creation moved with the smooth, relentless power of a giant, ticking clock. Grace perched on the seat beside her sister, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with pure, unadulterated excitement. "Sweet mother of pearl," Sheriff Briggs breathed, his horse dancing nervously beneath him, its eyes wide with terror. The mechanical wagon rolled forward with an unstoppable, terrifying purpose. Its golden fittings and polished brass caught the morning light and threw it back in dazzling, blinding patterns. Professor Peyton's men, hardened riders and ranch hands, scattered like startled birds. Their horses reared and snorted in terror, completely unnerved by the impossible sight and the thunderous sound. Catherine's voice rang out, clear and strong, a triumphant cry above the mechanical symphony she had created. "This," she shouted, "is what happens when you leave me alone with broken things and time to think." But her moment of triumph lasted only for a few fleeting seconds. A sharp, ugly crack split the air. It was the sound of a gunshot. Josiah stumbled backward, a look of stunned surprise on his face. A dark red stain blossomed and spread across the front of his simple workshirt, like spilled paint on a canvas. "Josiah!" Grace screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure agony that cut through every heart present. Catherine's amazing, impossible machine ground to a halt with a screech of tortured metal. She leapt down from the driver's seat, her invention forgotten, and scrambled to catch Josiah before he hit the dusty ground. "Papa! Papa Josiah!" Grace cried, the word Papa spilling from her lips for the very first time, a desperate, heartbroken plea. In the chaos of rearing horses and shouting men, nobody could say for sure who had fired the shot. The bullet had come from somewhere within Peaton's group of riders. Sheriff Briggs dismounted quickly, his face now a grim, hard mask of stone. The situation had just escalated beyond his control. "That's enough!" he commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of the law. "Every one of you, lower your weapons, right now!" Josiah's eyes fluttered as Catherine cradled his head in her small hands, her face streaked with tears and dust. "Stay with us," she whispered desperately, her voice choked with sobs. "Please, please don't leave us alone again." But Professor Peaton, it seemed, wasn't finished with his cruel game. He hadn't even flinched. "Unfortunate," he said coldly, not even bothering to dismount from his horse. He looked down at the scene with a chilling lack of emotion. "But the children still require proper guardians. Mr. Crawford clearly cannot provide them with adequate protection." Catherine looked up at him, her green eyes blazing with a grief and fury so intense it was like looking into the heart of a fire. "You did this!" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You brought guns to our home!" "I brought opportunity, my dear child," Peaton replied smoothly, his composure unnervingly intact. "An opportunity which you have just so spectacularly demonstrated you are ready for. That remarkable machine. It proves you need the resources only I can provide." Sheriff Briggs was now kneeling beside Josiah, his experienced hands checking for a pulse. "He's alive," he announced, his voice grim. "But he needs a doctor. Fast." "The nearest doctor is in Cheyenne," the banker, Holcomb, pointed out with a tone of false concern, a sly, knowing look on his face. "A 3-hour ride, by a fast horse. Unless, of course," he added, glancing at Peaton, "the good professor's private physician just so happened to be traveling with his party." The trap. The trap was perfectly laid, and it snapped shut around Catherine with a cold, metallic click. She had two choices. Accept Peaton's help, go with him, and owe him everything, becoming his property. Or stay here and watch Josiah, the only father she had left, bleed to death on his own land. Catherine's mind raced, the possibilities spinning like the gears of her own inventions. There had to be another way. There was always another way, if you were smart enough, if you were clever enough to find it. And then, a new sound cut through the tense standoff. The sound of approaching hoofbeats and something else. A faint, musical jingling. A stagecoach appeared on the horizon, cresting the nearby hill. But it was moving faster than any normal conveyance should travel. And this wasn't any ordinary coach. Even from a distance it gleamed and shimmered in the morning sun like it was made of solid gold. Professor Peaton's face, which had remained so calm and composed, suddenly went white as a fresh sheet of snow. A look of pure, unadulterated fear flashed in his cold eyes. "No," he whispered, the single word lost in the wind. "No. She couldn't have found me here." The golden coach drew closer, pulled by 6 magnificent white horses whose polished brass harnesses sang like tiny bells in the wind. The driver, a distinguished-looking gentleman in a fine gray coat, brought the impossible, beautiful vehicle to a halt directly between Peaton's posse and the wounded, desperate family on the ground. From inside the coach stepped a woman who commanded attention without saying a single word. Her hair was the color of spun silver, catching the light like a halo, and her eyes, the color of a winter sky, held the kind of quiet, unshakable authority that came from years of making important, difficult decisions. She looked at Professor Peyton, and when she spoke, her voice carried the refined, educated sound of the East Coast. But underneath that polish lay a core of steel as strong and unyielding as any Wyoming rancher's. "Hello, Aldrich," she said, her voice deadly calm. "We need to talk." The golden stagecoach rolled up the dusty hill like something pulled straight from a fairy tale. Its shiny paint caught the morning sunlight and threw it back in brilliant, blinding flashes. Catherine, her hands pressed against Josiah's bleeding chest, trying to staunch the flow of blood, could only stare at this impossible sight. Josiah was lying in the dirt beside her, his breathing shallow and ragged, and a golden coach had just appeared out of nowhere. The coach was pulled by 6 magnificent white horses, each one more beautiful than any animal she had ever seen. Their brass fittings jingled and sang like church bells in the morning air. The woman who stepped down from the coach moved with the easy, confident grace of someone who had never known a day of hunger or fear in her life. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat, elegant bun, and her deep blue traveling dress probably cost more money than most folks in Wyoming saw in a year. But her eyes, those winter blue eyes, held something Catherine recognized instantly. It was pain and loss. The kind of loss that changes you forever, that hollows you out but fills you back up with iron. "Professor Peyton," the woman said, her voice cutting through the tense, heavy atmosphere like a sharp knife through butter. "How lucky I am to find you all the way out here." Peyton's face was ashen, the color of old snow. His hands, which had been so steady, started to shake. For the first time since he had arrived at the ranch, he looked scared. Genuinely, terrifiedly scared. "Margaret," he stammered, his voice a choked whisper. You're supposed to be in San Francisco." "Plans change, Aldrich," the woman replied, her gaze as cold and hard as a frozen lake. She walked past the armed mounted men as if they were nothing more than fence posts, her attention focused solely on the small, desperate group on the ground. She knelt beside Catherine and Josiah, her expensive dress getting dirty in the dust without a single flicker of concern. "These children," she said, her voice softening slightly as she looked at Catherine, "need help, not your empty, poisonous promises." Grace, who had been hiding behind the massive wheels of the mechanical wagon, peeked out, her thumb still firmly planted in her mouth. "Who are you, lady?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. The woman offered Grace a faint, sad smile. "My name is Margaret Ashworth, sweetheart, and I have been looking for your sister for a very, very long time." She reached out and touched Catherine's shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Your father," she said, her blue eyes locking with Catherine's green ones, "was the finest watchmaker in all of California. He was a genius. He wrote to me, you know. Right before he died. He told me all about his brilliant daughter, the girl who could fix anything with gears and springs." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to stop spinning. You knew my pa?" "He was my dearest friend," Margaret said, and for a moment the iron in her eyes softened with grief. "When the fever took your family, I hired Professor Peyton. I paid him a great deal of money to find you and your sister and to bring you somewhere safe, to bring you to me." Margaret's voice turned cold again, hard as winter wind on the plains. She stood up and faced Peyton, who seemed to be shrinking in his saddle. "Instead," she said, her voice ringing with accusation, "he sent me a telegram. He told me you had died with your parents. He told me he was too late." Peyton started to back his horse away, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape route. But Sheriff Briggs, his face grim as a thundercloud, moved his own horse to block Peyton's path. "Sheriff," Peyton pleaded, his voice thin and whiny, "this is a misunderstanding." "Seems to me," the sheriff said, his voice a low growl, "like there's a whole lot more to this story than just some bank debts." "Much more," Margaret agreed, her voice sharp and clear. She reached into a pocket in her coat and pulled out a thick envelope. "I have letters here. she announced, holding the envelope up for all to see. Dozens of them. Letters from young people all across the West. All of them brilliant, promising young inventors. And all of them, according to Professor Peaton's official reports to his investors, tragically deceased. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. All of them are actually alive. They are working in his secret, hidden factories, creating wonders while he takes the credit and all of the money. The truth hit Catherine like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. Peaton hadn't just wanted to take her away. He had wanted to erase her, to steal her inventions, to steal her future, just like he had done to so many others. "The children stay here," Margaret announced, her voice leaving no room for argument. She stood tall, a queen surveying her domain. "And this ranch will become something special. It will become a place where young minds like Catherine's can grow and create, protected by people who truly care about them." Josiah stirred on the ground, his eyes fluttering open. He coughed, a weak, painful sound. "Catherine. Grace." "We're here, Papa Josiah," Grace whispered, running to his side and taking his hand. She used the name that felt more natural, more right than breathing. But Peaton wasn't finished yet. His face was a twisted mask of desperation and rage. With a desperate, animalistic snarl, he made his final, terrible move. He reached for the gun holstered at his hip, but he wasn't aiming for the sheriff. He wasn't aiming for Margaret. He was aiming for the source of all his problems. He was aiming for Catherine. The world slowed to a crawl. The glint of sunlight on the barrel of Peaton's gun. The feral snarl on his face. The collective gasp from the men watching. Catherine was frozen. Her mind still reeling from the revelations, her body still weak from the fear for Josiah. But Grace wasn't frozen. In her small pocket was a toy Catherine had made for her just a week before. It was a little wooden bird, and if you wound a key on its side, its wings would flap. But Catherine, in a fit of cleverness, had added a small, hidden mechanism. If you pressed a secret button, a tiny spring-loaded metal pellet would shoot out of the bird's beak. It was just a game, a way to knock over tiny tin soldiers. Grace's hand shot into her pocket. She pulled out the bird, her small thumb finding the hidden button without thought. She pointed it at the big, fancy horse Peaton was riding. Click. The tiny metal pellet, no bigger than a pea, shot across the yard and struck Peaton's stallion squarely on the flank. It wasn't enough to hurt the animal, but it was more than enough to startle it. The magnificent black horse screamed and reared violently, its front hooves lashing out at the sky. Peaton, caught completely off guard, was thrown from the saddle. He landed hard in the dust with a sickening thud, his gun flying from his hand and skittering away under the carriage. Before he could even think about getting up, Sheriff Briggs was on him, his knee pressed firmly into Peaton's back, his own gun pointed at the back of the professor's head. "It's over, Professor," the sheriff growled. Holcomb the banker, seeing how the tide had turned, tried to quietly slip away. But two of the sheriff's deputies, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing unease, spurred their horses forward and blocked his path. His escape was cut off. He was trapped, just like his partner in crime. Margaret's private physician, the one who had been traveling with her in the golden coach, was already kneeling by Josiah's side, his skilled hands working quickly and efficiently to clean and bandage the wound. "The bullet passed clean through," he announced after a few tense moments. "It missed anything vital. He's lost a lot of blood, but he's a strong man. He will recover." A wave of relief so powerful it made Catherine's knees weak washed over her. She sank to the ground, the adrenaline finally leaving her body, and just sobbed. Grace wrapped her small arms around her sister's shoulders, and the two of them clung to each other, a tiny island in a sea of chaos. 10 months later, in the warm, bright spring of 1871, Catherine stood in the middle of her brand-new workshop, and it was more beautiful than anything she had ever dared to dream. The room was filled with tools that sparkled like jewels in the morning light. A small, efficient steam engine hummed quietly in the corner, powering a series of belts and pulleys on the ceiling. Gears of every possible size and shape hung from wooden pegs along the walls, organized and ready. Through the wide, clean windows, she could see Grace. She was sitting in the garden with 3 younger children, teaching them how to weave intricate patterns with brightly colored thread. The ranch had changed so completely, it was almost unrecognizable. Where the old broken fences once sagged, neat white buildings now stood. They were workshops, classrooms, and comfortable living spaces for 12 young inventors who had come from all across the territory. Margaret Ashworth had been true to her word. She had used her considerable fortune and influence to transform the broken-down ranch into a haven, a place where children with special, unusual gifts could learn and grow without fear of being misunderstood or exploited. "Catherine," Grace called from the garden, her voice bright and happy. "Come see what Tommy built." Catherine smiled, wiping a smudge of grease from her hands with a clean rag. Tommy was only 9 years old, but he had a gift for making things that moved. Just yesterday, he had shown her a delicate wooden bird that could actually fly for short distances, its wings powered by a tightly wound spring. She walked outside into the warm sunshine and found Grace and the other children gathered around a small table. Tommy had built something amazing. It was a miniature town, complete with tiny houses, little roads, and even a miniature golden stagecoach. But the magic happened when Tommy turned a small handle on the side of the table. Everything came to life. The tiny coach moved along the roads, little wooden people walked between the buildings, and, impossibly, a thin stream of real smoke came out of the tiny chimneys of the houses. "It's wonderful, Tommy," Catherine said, and she meant every word. "How did you make the smoke?" Tommy grinned, showing a gap where his front teeth used to be. "Miss Margaret showed me. We used tiny copper pipes and steam from a kettle, just like your big engines, but smaller." Margaret herself appeared beside them, a warm smile on her face. She was carrying a letter with an official-looking wax seal on it. "Speaking of engines, Catherine," she said, "I have some news from the railroad company. They were so impressed with your prototype, they want to order 50 of your automatic switching devices." Catherine's heart gave a joyful leap. Her invention, a device that could change train tracks automatically without requiring a worker to stand in a dangerous place, was going to be used. The railroad men had told her it would save lives and make the trains run more efficiently. "50?" she gasped. That's more than I've ever made." "Which brings me to another piece of news," Margaret continued, her blue eyes twinkling with mischief. "The territorial governor has heard about our little school. He wants to visit next month. He's very interested to see what young minds can accomplish when they are given the proper support and encouragement." From the porch of the main house, which had been rebuilt and expanded, Josiah watched his girls with a pride that swelled in his chest like warm bread rising in the oven. The doctor had said his wounded shoulder would always be a little stiff, a permanent reminder of that terrible day. But he didn't mind. It was a small price to pay for the miracle that had transformed not just his life, but the lives of so many children. The golden stagecoach now sat in the main barn, which had been converted into Catherine's favorite workspace. She had tinkered with it, of course, adding wheels that could be steered, allowing her to move it anywhere on the ranch. Sometimes she used it to carry her larger inventions out to the testing grounds behind the workshops. Professor Peeton was in a federal prison now, thanks to the unshakable testimony of Sheriff Briggs and the mountain of evidence Margaret had provided. 12 young people had been freed from his secret factories, and 6 of them had chosen to come and live and learn at what the newspapers were now calling the Crawford Ranch School for Young Inventors. "Papa Josiah," Grace said, running up to the porch to hug his waist. "Catherine says she's going to build a machine that can wash all our clothes at once. Is that even possible?" Josiah chuckled, ruffling her hair. He remembered that day, not even a year ago, when he thought his life was over, when he was just a broken man on a broken ranch. He looked out at the bustling, happy school, at his 2 wonderful daughters, and he smiled. "With your sister," he said, his voice thick with love. "Anything is possible, little one. Anything at all." As the sun began to set over the Wyoming territory, painting the wide-open sky in brilliant shades of gold and purple, the sounds of laughter, learning, and whirring inventions filled the evening air. The Crawford family, a family forged not by blood but by love and loyalty, had discovered something far more valuable than any of Peeton's stolen treasures. They had learned that a home isn't a place you find on a map. It's a feeling you build, piece by piece, with the people you choose to love. If you enjoyed this story of justice and invention, and you want to hear more tales of the strange and mysterious, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe.